Last time we talked about God's holiness and how God was transcendently different than us. And today we need to talk about the consequence of that, and it's God's wrath. This is the part of the teaching of God that unfortunately sometimes is the most popular with people who are far from church. When we talk about God being a wrathful God, you picture God throwing thunderbolts down at us. In fact, people will even joke about that in some of their language. You know, I'd go to church, but the building would probably collapse or lightning would hit me on the way in. And I've been in church a long time, and that hardly ever happens. But that concern that it could, that God is different and I'm such a mess and there's no way that God would want to deal with somebody like me. Well, that's all talking about God's wrath. When you think about acts of God, when you think about how, sorry, Gabe. When you think about acts of God and how God, like an insurance deal, yeah, they lost their car, it was an act of God. That's always God's wrath. But you know, I want you to think a little bigger than that. I want you to think about why certain things happen. I really don't like how I'm starting on this.
You can restart.
That's okay. I won't restart. We'll just pretend like that didn't happen. The acts of God thing. Or I'm going to do it, but let's. Even acts of God. When you think about acts of God, and like an insurance company said, oh, the tree fell on the car or blew all the shingles off. Well, that's just an act of God, and you know, insurance may or may not cover. The acts of God typically are those wrath pictures. And again, I kind of hate that phrase. Why couldn't an act of God be a sunset or a new puppy or something? But when we think about it, it's always that. And it's easy for people to think of God that way. And where I want you to know where that concept comes from, that's real, is that God, the Bible does paint God as occasionally being wrathful. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it says, "The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them and his messengers again and again because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God. They mocked God. They despised his words. They scoffed until the wrath of God was finally aroused." The picture that's coming here is that God is patient with us. He tries to do the right thing. He shows us his grace. He shows us his holiness. But eventually enough's going to be enough. One of the more famous stories about the wrath of God's in Genesis chapter 18 and 19. It's about Sodom and how that city was so violent and so wicked that finally God cast them out. And that's an important story, and it's important to understand about how God's wrath. But before that, that's all in Genesis 19. But in Genesis 18, you see this interesting argument between Abraham and God. And Abraham's saying, but what if there's a couple righteous people there? God, won't you save them? I mean, what if there's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 10? Or won't you do something? Won't the judge of all the earth do what's right? And God promises him, I'll take care of the righteous. God's wrath always has to be considered with that balance. He's pure and he's righteous and he's holy and he's going to do what's right eventually. When you think about the wrath of God, one of the stories that pops up all the time is Noah's Ark. Ken Ham in the Noah's Ark Museum and everything, he doesn't like how this story sometimes has become a kid's story, you know, fluffy animals and all that kind of stuff, because it is a crazy, hard thing to think about the whole world being flooded, to think about every living thing except for a very few drowning. The wrath of God is poured out like a flood in Noah's Ark, and it's one of the clearest pictures of how God finally will say, enough's enough. I just can't take this anymore. At Calvary, it's worth thinking about what Jesus does to intercept that flood of wrath. And we're going to talk more about that over the next couple sessions, but at Calvary, Jesus sees the wrath of God pouring out, and he stands in the gap, and he pays the price. One thing that has to be considered when you think about God's wrath and God's judgment that's certainly going to come to all sinners, and we're all sinners, is that Jesus offers us a path out. And we'll talk about that in the next session.